More than 20 years ago, Amy and I were introduced to our first donkey, Izzy. We almost immediately found other donkeys that needed our help. We founded the Peaceful Valley Donkey Rescue as a means to save those donkeys and put them in loving homes. Over the next 20 years, we grew into the largest equine rescue in the United States. We have since taken our talents and resources abroad. We started in the Caribbean, where we improved the lives of countless donkeys on many islands. In 2018, we learned about the mass slaughter of donkeys in Australia.
So from West Texas to the world, y'all, this is Peaceful Valley's Donkey Rescue International. Donkeys were one of the main tools of colonization throughout that whole period of the European migration around the world. Donkeys built the wealth. They were brought here as indentured servants, much like they were in the United States and the Caribbean. At the conclusion of World War II, there was a surplus of army equipment. Most people replaced their donkeys with jeeps and tractors. The donkeys were then released to fend for themselves. In 1949, there was enough wild donkeys in Australia that the government declared them a pest.
When I found out that in the last 30 odd years, almost 600,000 donkeys have been killed in this part of the country, that was a very shocking fact for me to find out. And that there were just a few of them left, that I could have some part in both keeping those donkeys alive and the possibility of donkeys continuing to live in this amazing country. That was an offer too good to refuse.
At just over 163,000 square miles, the Kimberley is the northernmost region of Western Australia. In this region, which is roughly the size of California, the Australian government killed 500 to 600,000 wild donkeys here.
In a country like Australia, there is a very clear divide between appropriate nature and inappropriate nature that I personally do not subscribe to. I think there's some strong ethical and philosophical claims to say that these are very problematic ideas, that the only nature that we can call nature is the one that existed before a particular white man stepped on the shores of Australia. James Cook, like that he is the defining moment that nature becomes no longer nature. And everything that comes and establishes in these wild environments after that, and of course they're going to have ecological effects. It's not possible to be alive without having ecological effects.
It's really interesting. We have this huge, wild, rugged landscape where they've tragically and brutally killed 500,000 donkeys. And this landowner, Chris Hengler, has found my work and my advisor Ariane's work online and asked us to come see if we could help, because he thinks these donkeys are playing a really important role in reducing wildfire and restoring these landscapes.
What does Kachana mean?
Kachana means far away. In a Southern African Esperanto, if you're in Southern Africa and you say Kachana, most people know it's far away. Having lost our farm in Africa for political reasons, and having read books, in one story in particular, of how people had to leave the land they loved and start again, I thought, well, this is far enough away. I've got country that was abandoned by its original inhabitants, ignored by industry. It was desertifying. I thought, well, it had water, it had the basic ingredients that Mother Nature uses to build an economy. It had sunshine, water, and there was space and rocks and that. So I thought, I'll be left alone. This is the place where I can test my mettle.
And when I heard about what the folk at Kachana were doing, that they were trying to moved from a situation that was really bad, like terrible desertification, mass slaughter of an animal, donkeys, that I care very deeply about, and trying to move to a situation where native animals and non-native animals, donkeys, could live and contribute to bringing water and life back to the land. I thought that that was an incredibly exciting project, partly because it wasn't just about an ideal, it was about working with what's actually here.
I've been working in the Kimberley for about 38 years as an archaeologist, now retired, now writing. Chris and Jackie's efforts, and particularly when his father was alive, to keep that herd has been a constant battle. The Department of Parks and Wildlife and the Ag Department pay quite frequent visits, and they want to get rid of his donkeys. So he's had to really battle to keep that very small herd.
When the donkey shooters came around, fortunately they were both farm boys from Queensland, I took them for a walk and I showed them what we were doing with the cattle and the benefit of more mouths and more hoofs in a country like this managed. So the lads said, right, what we can do is we can just have a no-shoot zone between this gorge and the next gorge. So that's about a 12-kilometre long valley, which is up to a kilometre wide. So plenty of space for the donkeys, understocked because there's not enough cattle and not many donkeys. And they said, well, they'll control spillage to the south, and they'll monitor spillage into the Chamberlain Valley, which is where the donkeys could have readily gone. And I said, well, that's great. Well, we've got the on the ground stuff sorted. I'll try and talk to the government people. And I started writing letters and asking people, but I never got a response. But given the fact that it was working on the ground, I was quite happy, and for 20 years that went quite well. There was a change of the guards occasionally, and then the people dropped in and I showed what was going on, and we compared notes, and it was all really good until I think it was 2017, and there was another change of the guards, and all of a sudden the finger was pointed at us saying, why have you got donkeys? And I said, hang on, we've been trying to engage in this discussion formally already since 2007 or earlier.
Donkey's a funny one. I think if someone had asked us 10 years ago if we ever thought we'd have that much involvement about donkeys, we'd all be like, nah. What do you mean, So I suppose in the early days, me growing up, I think it would have been 14 maybe, when Dad said, look, we need some dog food. So off I went and harvested my first donkey and cut it up and carried it home and fed it to the dogs, and they were just another animal. We knew that they had a place and they never bothered us. They were just out there. They were just wild donkeys on the property. The donkey shooting program had been going for years, so like probably most Australian boys in the farm, I was into guns and into shooting things, and if there was donkeys in areas that Dad didn't want them, we'd go harvest them for dog meat. And apart from that, we knew there was an area where we had a good stable population of donkeys, and the donkey shooters at the time, it was directly with the shooters. We said, look, can you leave them in that area? They're not bothering us there in this area. We're keeping in control of them. Anywhere else, run your program. So I suppose that's what happened just for years, and no one really thought too much about it.
I'm really interested in how do we achieve a life situation where all beings on this planet, human beings, animal beings, native animal beings, non-native animal beings, earth beings, tree beings, can live where we can all flourish to our maximum potential. And human beings haven't done very well at doing that for the last 80 or so years in particular. We've been very interested in what benefits us, or at least some of us, to the expense of most other animals and the planet.
And you'd be allocated a certain area and just basically grid flying it and shooting whatever you saw. in those early days there was some big numbers, particularly the donkeys, and so it was a matter of starting at the back of the mob and working your way through, and then come back around, make sure they're all
How many do you think you would shoot in a day?
Well, it depends on some areas you were just shooting solidly for the whole sortie. You could shoot, usually would run out of ammunition before you'd run out of donkeys. In some of those you'd shoot maybe 600 to 1,000 in a sortie, in a 3-hour sortie. That first shoot we shot, I'm pretty sure it was about 20,000 donkeys in 2 weeks.
It's quite interesting, this play with words, eradication and reduction. I suspect that most pastoral station owners don't realise that the effort by government is to eradicate, not merely to cull the numbers. There was a great deal of money involved in those early years. Chopper pilots were being paid an enormous amount of money to get up there and herd these donkeys together. And of course pastoral station owners were also being paid, and individual contractors. And in those early days, donkey meat was used for pet meat, and so it was another incentive. Now that the Department of Parks and Wildlife and the Agricultural Department, primarily the Agricultural Department, they have shooters that specifically go out now in helicopters and just shoot every donkey that's there.
Many of the ones that I've talked to agree that there was a need to control the populations, and there are quite a few that seemed quite surprised that total eradication is now on the agenda, or some said, well, the question is, at what point did donkey control become donkey eradication?
Did you do any of the culls where they were using the Judas donkeys?
Yeah, so when
and explain for me, if you would, what a Judas, how the program worked.
Yeah, so when you shoot a big area like, you know, several million acres, the first time round you grid fly the country, and then you come back next year, grid fly the country, maybe do it twice a year for a couple of years, and you fly doing a lot of flying and not getting much of a result, so it gets very expensive per animal. So what they were doing was put a radio tracking collar on a young female usually, and let her go with the radio tracking collar and just come back several times a year, track her down, shoot all her mates, and then let her go until the battery ran out.
It seemed to me that they kept on using the same Jenny, and just every time she gathered a few mates, they'd come around and shoot it, and I think that would have been pretty hard on the Jenny.
The Judas method is so unspeakably cruel. Like, to design a method of killing which is using an animal's love as the method of bringing death, I can't think of anything more heinous. It's like putting poison in a mama's milk and then getting her to put her baby to her breast. And that we don't even think through what that means is a national crime. And I want people to think about that. I want people to think about, what are we doing to these other beings who love their families like we love our families?
Well, I know that they are shooting a lot of donkeys. Donkeys are not commercially valuable in Australia, so they will be culled. And when they're culled, they generally been shot and left to rot without being exploited for their potential value.
Generally, there's a view that there are some species that one would prioritize to get rid of, and those are usually either species where there's quite strong evidence that their ecologies are contributing to the extinctions of native species, or that there's strong suspicions that they may be, or that they're having very strong ecological effects that conflict with or change the ecosystem in a fundamental way, or that they come into conflict with agriculture or conservation. Donkeys are a large animal, they're quite noticeable, and their effects are quite noticeable. They can be described as ecological engineers, but they are not a quote-unquote native species, and so by default, whatever a donkey does is a bad something. The way that when we talk about words like biodiversity, or you might hear in the news that there's an extinction crisis, that an extinction crisis means that there was a certain number of species and now there's a lot less. If in a place like the Kimberley, the mass essentially eradicating an entire population of a uniquely adapted donkey population from this area suddenly becomes an extinction event, whereas before there was no event at all.
From an archaeological perspective, when we talk about the decimation of wildlife, there's absolutely no doubt from the evidence that we have that Aboriginal people were hunting the last of the late Pleistocene megafauna. We get it in the rock art, and we're now, we also are now starting to find kill sites, particularly in Queensland. So the evidence is growing. The fact that they disappeared off the landscape is further evidence that they were definitely hunted to extinction. We have not changed at all. We are doing exactly the same thing with our introduced animals, such as the cattle, donkeys, even the native dingo. We have enough evidence to show when that arrived, and yet here we are saying that it's a feral animal introduced, despite the fact that it's had 5,000 years to actually become an integral part of keeping a whole range of animals in our system. So it's devastating.
Do most people in Australia understand the mass slaughter that took place?
Most people in Australia don't know, let alone understand. So that question has two parts. Firstly, they don't know. And in Australia now, there's a kind of passive acceptance that these animals that we classify as non-native, that they're bad for the country. So that's just assumed. To give you an example, I was at an event at the university last week and the Chancellor asked me what I was working on at the moment, and I said that I was working on this project and on trying to stop the mass slaughter of donkeys in the Kimberley. And she said, oh, well, camels and donkeys are really bad for the country. And I said, we're academics, we're supposed to make claims on the basis of what we actually know. And everyone just says that without knowing whether that's the fact or not. It's just taken for granted. These animals are bad. They're not only bad for the country, but they're bad for these other animals that we care about, endangered species. And so not only don't we care about them, but they deserve to be killed.
I had no idea there was any donkey situation. I think you make, as soon as you've got non-native species, you make a huge impact to the ecosystem. And that can be to the detriment of the local native species, and you just change the whole ecosystem. And obviously that ecosystem has been in balance for thousands and thousands of years. So any change has to be thought out, well thought out, not just rushed. But yeah, I'm pretty much for removing and eradicating or dealing with introduced species that are not native to Australia.
I think the donkeys have never had much of a profile outside of the Kimberley. Most Australians don't even know what happens in the Kimberley on cattle stations, or there's only it's quite a popular tourist destination now, but it's been a little bit undiscovered in more recent times, and still only a small percentage of the Australian population have got a real appreciation for what goes on here.
They haven't embraced it yet, and it is an integral component of Australia's history, the mining industry particularly, the very early gold strikes when donkeys were used by the Afghan camel drivers. It should be embraced, but we don't seem to embrace any component like that. And there's no effort to bring that into any education program that I can see.
So I'd never heard about these massive culls of donkeys. I was worried a lot more about the use of wild donkeys in the trade to China, to be honest. And I was absolutely dumbfounded when I heard that our government were killing these amazing creatures at the scale that they were doing it. So I think if this was more widely publicized, because as I said, living in Australia, never heard of it, never seen it on any program, on the news. You know, it was complete news to me. And I'm sure the many donkey owners that I know personally and all around Australia would be absolutely horrified and disgusted to know that this was happening and was sanctioned by our government.
Look, I think it's probably a combination of both. People don't know enough, don't understand. They particularly do not understand that donkeys have had over 100 years to actually fit into the ecosystem. And I think they just have a total lack of understanding of how many donkeys have actually been killed and that it's now open slather. There's no effort to, in fact, cull. It's really total annihilation.
If 5% of the Australian population have an idea of what's going on in the landscape, that would be very comforting. I doubt we have that.
Seriously though, Mark, I mean, I had no idea that was going on. You know, no idea.
Australia is the home of introduced animals. Not just donkeys, but we're talking horses, camels, water buffalo, and most recently the cane toad, which was brought here to eat cane beetles, but nobody told them to stay put in the sugarcane fields. So they are decimating certain birds, reptiles, and even mammals here in Australia.
The pastoral society in Australia looks, it is in their benefit to look after the land. It's in their benefit to manage pastoral land and the habitat, because when that habitat degrades, they lose. Australian native animals aren't that adaptable to, if we go and we completely change their environment. They've been isolated that long. For them to adapt won't take 100 years. It'll take thousands of years to adapt. So by bringing in large animals that have been here for hundreds of years, since the early British settlers brought their own cattle, they brought Brahman cattle from India and from the US, and that's becoming an industry. People have to eat. As long as it's being done sustainable, personally, I don't see anything wrong with it.
On the one hand, the eradication of not just donkeys, but several other species of wild megafauna. It can be wild cattle, wild buffalo, in some areas wild boar. Australia is a feral place. Australia is one of the hot spots, or perhaps is the hot spot in the world of feral megafauna. That is, animals that used to be, if you want to go wild, this is where you do it. And these animals are having the ecological effects. And one very likely ecological effect that we're testing is their effects on fire. Because as these big herbivores are moving through the landscape, they're eating vegetation that would otherwise dry out and then be very flammable. They're also stepping on vegetation, and they're also moving nutrients around. So they're also making the soil potentially more productive. The hypothesis, yeah, that removing all of these megafauna, all of these big herbivores from the landscape, you know, this vegetation is going to go somewhere. So it's either going to go into the digestive system of a big animal, and from there into the soil, or it's going to go into the digestive system of fire.
The Kimberley is on fire. There is a direct correlation between the hundreds of thousands of donkeys the Western Australian government has killed and the amount of wildfires that just ravage this entire area.
I first saw some particularly interesting behaviour in the Bunga-Bungals in 1982, before it became a national park, and there was a very small population of donkeys, and it became very clear that their donkey pads around the lower part of the bungles was sufficient to keep fire from climbing into the bungles. As soon as they were culled, the burning has been horrendous.
The tool of fire historically in Australia is a new tool. It came when the first humans arrived.
I mean, I am not an expert on the history of wildfire in Australia, but from what I've heard talking to Chris and other people that are deeply invested, is that increases in wildfire and the use of that as a management tool has led to really strong changes in this place.
People are now starting to realise where there are no animals to manage, so obviously the cattle have come in, sheep and horses and the donkeys, and there's been an impact on the environment. And a lot of the academics have this idea that hard-footed animals are inappropriate in Australia, which I believe is rubbish. That's the belief, is that it's about numbers. So they keep reducing the numbers and consequently end up with more combustible material, so fire becomes a bigger issue.
I think definitely what we all started seeing is that the areas where the donkeys were all removed, the country was looking worse than the area where the donkeys still were. So you're sort of going, well, hang on a minute, aren't we removing them to make the country better? How come it's going worse? You know, and we had an area at home in the early years that Dad destocked a lot of cattle out of. They sold a lot of cattle out of then. And the country deteriorated more rapidly after the cattle had gone. So I suppose Dad picked up pretty early. He was like, hang on a minute, you know, we've got a severe grazer, we've got a herbivore here, and we're removing that herbivore, but we're not replacing it with anything. And someone forgot to tell the grass to stop growing, you know, and because no one told the grass to stop growing, the grass kept growing, and then next thing we had fires. Some were lightning strike, but there was also the arson component occasionally as well. And that's not just on our place, that's for the majority of the rangelands of the Kimberley.
I asked someone in this area how many days in a year, or how many months in a year, is the Kimberley not burning? And they said it's always burning. There's always a fire somewhere in the Kimberley.
While this film is focused on the Kimberley, the same animal eradication has taken place across the entire Australian continent, numbering in the tens of millions. Donkeys, horses, camels, water buffalo, and other large herbivores have been eradicated. While climate change might have something to do with the fires that is ravaging the Australian continent in 2019 and 2020, removing these herbivores has fed the problem.
Before humans arrived in Australia, there were all these big animals, giant wombats, giant unnameable things, you know, just beasts. And when these animals went extinct from human hunting, wildfire frequency increased dramatically. So there's a massive shift in vegetation structure, because you have to think about that animal gut, that fermentation chamber, as a kind of internal, warm, wet fire that's happening inside the animal. And so donkeys, by consuming this grass, especially this really unpalatable, low nutrient grass that they're good at digesting, much better than cows are, by digesting that in their own internal furnaces, they very well may have effects on the fire frequency and severity, which can have effects on tree establishment and growth rates and what kind of future this landscape has.
Every year there's a little bit more bare ground. You don't necessarily see it when you're driving past, but when you're flying over the air, you do see this plant spacing becoming sparser, or greater. And the more bare ground that when the sun goes down is radiating heat, that's what's playing havoc with the wind patterns, and then you get more erratic weather patterns, and that's what's going to bite us in the tail.
There's been no improvement. I'm flying around that same country that we destocked, and the scars that were created by that inappropriate grazing management are still there, and they're not getting any better. Along some of the creeks where there's permanent water, you take the grazing away and there's a big change, and it looks great, but you don't have to go more than a few steps away from those moist riparian areas to find desertifying landscape all across the Kimberley.
We need gardeners. I mean, if I give you a bucket full of sand and a seed and I say grow something, well, what are you going to do? You're going to put the seed in the sand, you're going to put some ground cover there, some mulch, and you're going to fertilize it, and when the plant grows you'll water it and whatever, and then maybe even prune it. And that's exactly what the role of the large animals is, to mulch, evenly fertilize and prune plants.
On Kachana, Donkeys and cattle have formed the perfect symbiotic relationship. The cattle can take the wide open lands, the flat ground. The donkeys can go into the higher elevation and eat the fuel that fuels the wildfires.
I'd say 30% of Kachana is okay cattle grazing country. The rest is rocky escarpments and rangeland, we call it, you know. So the big thing is, I suppose, what we noticed in the rangelands more than in the plains and downs country where people were running big numbers of cattle is, you know, an example I bring a lot is if someone's got 10,000 cattle on a property, then they've got 10,000 mouths and 40,000 hooves eating and trampling vegetation. So that someone's there doing the job. Well, in the rangelands, you're not going to run 10,000 head of cattle, so you don't have those mouths, you don't have those hooves. The grass is still there. Something still needs to cycle that. And if you don't, if it's not an animal or a herbivore cycling it, sadly, it's fire up here in a big way.
We realise that we are to blame, but we can continue to be part of the problem, or we can be part of the solution. And the animals that we brought in could also be part of the solution. So it doesn't make sense to take a feral camel, a donkey or a horse and just kill them simply because they're misbehaving. Why not modify their behaviour and let them become part of the solution? Because what the country's telling me is we need more herbivores to cycle the vegetation, put it back into the ground, encourage the soil building so that we can sustain life.
When this planet was formed, carbon was released. So you don't create carbon, you don't kill carbon. Carbon is always here. We are carbon-based. There's carbon in the ground. So what we do is we take something like coal, which is predominantly carbon, and we burn it. And we take it from a solid to a gas, which then goes into the atmosphere. Trees help that process by drawing in the carbon, transmitting it through its roots and into the soil, which is then comes up in the form of grass, which the donkeys eat, process, and then return to the soil.
Hello there. I would like to introduce you to a friend of mine. Her name is Molly. She is a molecule of carbon. Molly and her mates have been here ever since the Earth was made. Carbon comes in many forms, including the graphite in your school pencils, and even in diamonds. They are in the skies above and in the oceans, in the mountains, in the valleys, in the trees, grass and bushes. They are even in the animals, and yes, they are in you and I too. Almost everything is made of carbon. Molly and all of the other carbon are an interesting lot because you never know how they will look. Say, for example, coal. Coal is a bunch of black rocks that we dig from the ground. Coal is made from carbon. We burn the coal to make steam that spins a turbine that creates electricity. And we all like electricity. But when we burn coal, something very interesting happens. It turns coal from a solid or rock into a gas or smoke, but it is still carbon. This sends a whole bunch of Molly's friends from being in the ground to being in the air. That's not a big deal, as long as we have trees and other things to bring them back down to the ground. Trees breathe carbon. They breathe it in and they push it down their insides. Some of the carbon goes into the leaves and some in the roots. The leaves may be eaten by animals and bugs or fall back to the ground, and the roots may push the carbon back into the ground. Grass, bushes and new trees take the carbon from the ground and use it to grow big and strong. But that's not the end of our story. We need animals. Lots and lots of animals. Animals known as herbivores, a fancy way of saying that they eat plants, mow the grass, bushes and prune the trees. When they digest it, the carbon returns to the ground to become fertiliser for new grass, bushes and trees. We need a wide variety of animals, some to eat in the valleys, some to eat on the hills, some to eat on the trees, and some to eat in those hard-to-get-to places. But what happens when all of the animals are taken away? Well, the grass, bushes and trees will keep growing and growing and growing until one day, fire consumes the grass, bushes and trees, just like the animals, but it sends the carbon back into the air. It also kills the trees, so Molly and her friends have no way of making it back into the ground where they belong. So we need animals. Lots and lots of animals. Not that many. We need just the right amount of animals. Just the right amount of healthy, happy animals that are different enough from one another that they can mow all of the grass, bushes and prune the trees. Some in the valleys, some on the hills, some in the trees and some in those hard to reach places. It is really quite simple. If we are proper caretakers of the planet, we can not only make the Earth a healthy and happy place for all of us and the animals, but we can make it a healthy and happy place for many, many generations to come.
We can produce a lot of grass in the Kimberley in a good wet season, and there's a lot of carbon, standing carbon on the in the above the ground every year, and it dries out. And if you don't recycle it organically through herbivores, then it's going to burn and it's going to go into the atmosphere and it's going to contribute to global warming. If we can recycle that carbon through herbivores, put it back in the soil can then hold more water, which is our most valuable resource in Australia and precious. Hold it in the soil where it should be so that we can grow more grass and put more carbon back in the soil. And that's the real thing that everyone in Australia needs to know, is that we have the ability in Northern Australia and do more than our fair share towards reversing global warming.
If we were to then accept wild donkeys as a wild animal, then we've actually gone from a critically endangered situation to a flourishing of a species across Australia. I think for about 70% of the wild donkeys' global range is in Australia. They have gone from a critically endangered species to a flourishing species. That's what rewilding is all about. The only thing that differentiates this from the return of wolves to Yellowstone, to a recovery of elephants in Africa, to any other kind of story where we all agree is a good story, is that we cannot compute in our minds that a donkey can ever be a wild animal.
I talk a lot about the work that Chris does on Kachana because it's an absolute winner, what he has managed to do on that property using both his cattle and the donkeys to regenerate vegetation, to remove desert and turn it into subtropical rainforest is an absolutely amazing example of what can be done.
Looking forward, there's a few big obvious things, and a big one for us is animal welfare. You know, we're saying, oh, they need to be happy and healthy, and if there's too many because, you know, they've been breeding, well then maybe we need to manage those numbers, and then we've got to look at options. And that's, I think, where again it comes down to the humans to manage that, you know, to say, okay, well, how do we manage that? And I think, you know, in the past it's been very brutally managed where they said, oh, we've got too many, let's get rid of the whole lot. And I thought, oh, well, I don't think that's ideal either.
We need to get our Australian government to start looking at the bigger picture. We need a holistic approach to this, and they're not doing that.
You know, they never really had a voice, I suppose, and then like you said, it's the animals that have probably served us the most get the least representation, and the times are tough.
I think we need to really ask ourselves, why do we value some animals and not others? And in the same way as we ought to be critical about everything we think about, what washing powder we use, what car we drive, what school we send our kids to, we need to think critically about, why do I hate this animal or not care about this animal? why do I classify this animal on this side of the deserves to live, deserves not to live fence? And ask ourselves, is there really an ethical basis for that, or is that just some arbitrary distinction that I've assumed, like from the Bible of government knowledge, is the truth?
You know, I think and that comes back to that mindset thing, and someone said it beautifully. I don't know who it is, so I can't quote them, but they said, you know, when they actually got up in the morning and thought, instead of what can I kill today, like, you know, what do I need to spray, what weed do I need to kill, what animals in the way, actually wake up and say, what can I help live today? You know, if you can change that mindset around to do that, then suddenly you see things differently, you know?
Let's try and find out how we can design a future that embraces the diversity that we have and build healthy, productive landscapes. And let's see how we can put ourselves and the animals that we brought to this country to better use for a better Australia, in a manner that we can look our grandchildren in the eye and say, well, with the knowledge available at the time, we did the best that we could.